In this video, you are going to learn how to set up CI/CD for your Docker project using GitHub and AWS ECS. So let's get started. In the previous videos, we created our AI voice assistant project and deployed it on Elastic Container Service, aka ECS. Now it's time to automate the deployment on cloud for whenever we make changes to the project. Okay, perfect. So how this project is going to work? So you as a developer, you write the code on your favorite IDE, VS Code for example. So once you write the code, you push the changes to GitHub. And on GitHub, we're gonna have two GitHub actions. The first GitHub actions will trigger whenever we make changes to the backend side. So for the first action, whenever we make changes on the backend code and the code reaches GitHub, the first action will be triggered to build and deploy the Docker image for the backend service. The image will be built and deployed to ECR repository. So we already have the ECR repository for the backend, which will receive the latest version for our Docker project, and then we trigger ECS to read the latest version for our ECR image for the backend. And the same will happen for the front end. When the code reaches GitHub and we made some change on the front end service, we're gonna have a second GitHub action which will read this process. So whenever we make changes to the front end code on our code base and this change arrives on GitHub, the second GitHub action will be triggered to do the same thing. It's going to build the latest version for our code, is going to build and deploy the latest version on the ECR repository on AWS for the front end service, and then we're going to trigger AWS ECS to read the latest version for our front-end ECR image. And that's pretty much it. So let's keep going. Before we proceed, if you like this kind of content, just give me a thumbs up, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you can learn more about Docker and the AWS infrastructure. And never forget that the more learn and practice you have, the better you become and more value you can provide. So let's do this. Okay, perfect. So this is the code base that we developed on the previous videos. So this is the backend, this is the front end. The application is already running on ECS. So this is our link. And this is what we developed previously. This is our ECS cluster. We have two services. The first service is the front end. The second service is the backend. So in this video, we're not going to talk about how to create an ECS cluster and how to create the services. We already have the infrastructure already developed from the previous videos. And if you go to ECR, we can see the Docker images for our projects. So this is the ECR image for the backend, and this is the ECR image for the front end. So what we're going to do in this video is to automate the process to deploy new changes to this infrastructure. So what we're going to do, this is the code base that we already have. So whenever we make changes to this code base, we're going to trigger a GitHub action to update the ECS service. Okay, perfect. So here on this branch, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new branch to start working on these changes. So I'm gonna call it, so I'm gonna use the git checkout command -b. I'm gonna call it feed. I'm gonna call it video CI/CD ECS. So all the changes that we're going to do will be on this new branch, video CI/CD ECS. Okay, perfect. In order to create some GitHub actions, what we need to do, we need to create on the root folder a new folder called .github. And inside this GitHub folder, we need to create another folder called workflows. This is what GitHub specifies for creating GitHub actions. Okay, perfect. So the first thing that we're going to create here is our GitHub action for the backend. So I'm gonna call it deploy backend app.yaml. Perfect. So I'm gonna copy and paste what I already did. So this is our script to trigger GitHub actions to update our backend service. The first thing that we define here is the name for our workflow. I'm calling it build and deploy backend app to ECS. Perfect. And then we define when this GitHub action will be triggered. So we're saying here that whenever we push changes to a folder in our code base called backend, which is the backend code here. So whenever we push changes to this folder on the code base on this branch, which is the feed video CI/CD ECS, which is the branch that we are working on right now on ECS. So whenever we push changes to this part of the code in this branch, we're going to run this workflow. Here I'm defining some environment variables. I'm defining the backend image on ECR, which is this name here. I'm defining the region, the default region. So in my case, since I'm working on Oregon, so this is going to be US West 2. In this case, I'm defining the name for the cluster, which is this name here. And I'm also defining the backend service here, which is this name here. Perfect. So here I define the actual job to be executed. First, I'm saying that I want to run this on a Ubuntu latest machine. Then I use this checkout command to have access to the code base on GitHub Actions. Then I set up the machine to run Docker. Since we are using Docker and ECS, then I need to set up Docker on GitHub Actions. But in my case, since I'm using ARM64, if you remember well, since my machine is an M1 Pro from Apple, so the Docker image that I created is also an ARM64. So all the infrastructure that I created here also uses the ARM64 infrastructure. If we go to the task definitions, you will see that the operating system that I'm using is an ARM64. Let me find it here. Here. As you can see, we're using the CPU architecture ARM64. So in order to build the image properly on GitHub Actions, I also need to set up the whole thing to use ARM64. So here we set up Docker on the machine. And then here we set up AWS CLI on GitHub Actions. So I'm passing here the access key ID and secret access key ID. In order to have this, you must create a user on IAM. You must go to IAM, create a user here, and then create credentials for this user. I already have a video showing how to do this. I'm gonna attach this video on the video description for you to have access to it, so you can create your new user to use on GitHub Actions. In my case, this is the user that I'm using for this test, for this application. Let's keep going. And then once we set up AWS CLI on the machine, we need to make login to Amazon ECR. If you remember well, whenever we want to make changes to an image on ECR, we need to run these push commands. So the first command is to make login into Amazon ECR. So here we're doing the login, but I'm using here some environment variables in the command. Once we make the login, we need to actually build and push the Docker image to ECR. So here I'm accessing the folder, which is the backend folder, and then I run the commands to build and push the new Docker image to ECR. Once we do this, I run the command to deploy the latest version on ECS. So here we're using the AWS CLI, and then we're running the command to update the service, and then we pass the cluster, and then we pass the service, and then we force a new deployment. Even though we did not change the test definition, we're basically forcing ECS to run the latest ECR image that we previously deployed. So this command here is equivalent to do AWS ECS update service, then we pass dash cluster, then we pass the AI voice assistant cluster, and so on. This is what we're doing on this command that we're doing here. And then we also need to pass the access key ID, the secret access key ID, and the default region. For some reason I could not pass environment variables here, so this is why I had to hard code the values for the cluster and the service. Okay, perfect. So this is our script to deploy changes on the backend. So let's go back to the browser. So this is the front end running. I'm gonna open up the backend. So this is the backend. As you can see, this is the hello world from MPCSJ. If we read the code base, you will see that this is here, hello world from MPCSJ, which is the root route. So if I update this to v2, so hello world from MPCSJ v2. If we do this and then we push the code, we're going to trigger this GitHub action to deploy the latest version of our FastAPI application on ECS. So I'm gonna push this git add git commit. I'm gonna call it feed on the backend, latest version of backend app. The commit message is up to you. Then we push this, then we use git push. The first push we need to use this set upstream. Perfect. Let's go back to GitHub. Let's go to actions. As you can see, our GitHub action is running here. In a few minutes, we will be able to see if it actually worked here. If it worked, this message will change. Okay, perfect. After a few minutes, the workflow is complete. Let's go back here to the link and refresh the page. As you can see, now I have the hello world from MPCSJ v2, which means that we could properly build and deploy the code from GitHub Actions to ECS. Perfect. Let's keep going now and do the same for the front end. Before we proceed, I think it's important to mention that here on this code, as you can see, I'm using some resources from GitHub. I'm using environment variables from GitHub, and I'm also using secrets. As you can see here, the difference is environment variables on GitHub, they can actually be displayed on the workflow. So if you check the logs, you can see the values that we define here. This is just an easy way for us to reuse GitHub actions. But for secrets, so as you can see here, we're passing the access key ID and the secret access key ID from AWS as a secret. So a secret will never be displayed in the logs. If you try to check the logs, if you try to log the secret value from the AWS access key and the secret access key, it will not be displayed here. Even if you try to make a log statement here, it will never be displayed as secret, but the environment variables will be displayed. So the way for you to set up this is go into settings for the project, and then you go here to secrets and variables. Here you can see my secrets. I'm passing the access key ID, I'm passing the secret access key ID, and some other ones that I'm actually not using in the GitHub action. I'm only using these two, but I created these other two for testing. And you also can define here your variables. As you can see, these are my variables, and it's okay for me to show to you them because they are not sensitive. This is just an easy way to reuse the script here for the GitHub actions. So, as a recap, variables are just an easy way for you to reuse these scripts here, but they are not sensitive information. Secrets, on the other hand, are actually sensitive information that we can never display to someone else. Perfect. Let's keep going. So we're gonna do something similar for the front end. So I'm gonna create a new script here. I'm gonna call it deploy frontend app.yaml. Perfect. So I'm gonna paste here what I already did. The name of the branch is actually video feed/video CI/CD ECS. So the name of the script is build and deploy frontend app to ECS. So whenever we make changes to the frontend folder, the frontend folder here, on this branch, which is the feed/video CI/CD ECS, we're going to run our workflow. And it's pretty much similar to what we did before. We check out the code. Sorry, this is just a testing, we don't need this. So we check out the code. We set up the ARM64 machine. We set up Docker on the machine, on these two here. We set up AWS CLI. We make a login to Amazon ECR. We go to the front-end folder and we actually build and push the image to ECR. But in this case, we're pushing the image to the front-end image, which is this one here, the AI voice assistant front end. So we are building and pushing the image to that repository, the front end one in this case, and then we run the command to deploy to ECS. So then we call the command again to ECS update service and the AI voice assistant cluster. So we pass the cluster and then we pass the front end service here. And then we force a new deployment because we're not changing the task definition. We're only changing the version for the ECR image. Perfect. So let's make a simple test here. So for example, this is our application. Let's change, for example, the background color. So let's go to the front end. Let's go here to styles, to the home version. So this is the background, which is a gradient. So I'm gonna change here the second color. I'm gonna pass like another, maybe a purple. So I'm gonna pass a purple. So it's going to be a blue and purple. Perfect. Let's set up the script here and the change on the front end. So I'm gonna say git add git commit. I'm gonna say refactor front end update background color. I'm gonna pass here an emoji and create script for deploying front end. It's up to you. And then we push this. Let's go back to GitHub. Let's go to actions and refresh the page. Okay, so it's not working. Let's see why. Oh, okay. We just committed this. Now we need to push. I just executed the git commit. Now I need to execute the git push command. Perfect. Let's go back here. Refresh the page. As you can see, the GitHub action to deploy the front end is actually running. Let's wait a little bit to see what's going to happen to our application. Okay, perfect. After a few minutes, as you can see, the deployment was succeeded. So let's go back to our application and refresh the page. Perfect. As you can see, the background color changed as we defined in our code base. Here. Perfect. Now our CI/CD process is complete for our application running on AWS ECS. And that's it. Now you know how to set up CI/CD for your applications using GitHub, GitHub Actions, and AWS ECS for your Docker applications. I hope you liked it, and I see you in the next time.